Boy, that went from 60 to 0 quickly. Not even a murmur. All right, welcome everyone. We're so thrilled for you to be here participating in today's event, Advancing Youth Mental Health, Perspectives from Youth and Families. Thank you for being with us today here in the room and virtually. At BPC, our mission is to bring together leaders from both sides of the aisle to craft real, workable solutions to the biggest challenges facing our country. Today's conversation centers on one of the most urgent and most unifying issues that we face, the mental health and well-being of our nation's young people. Since January 2024, BPC's Youth Mental Health and Substance Use Task Force has been focused on identifying federal policy solutions that support prevention, early intervention, and access to care for youth. We've heard it from a broad mix of stakeholders, experts, families, providers, and policymakers from across the political spectrum. We also recognize how much has changed since this work began, and that the policy landscape looks quite different today. There's real uncertainty about the future of youth mental health and substance use programs and the federal resources that support them. That makes our work even more important. We're still working to understand how HHS's proposal for reorganization will affect agencies like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, which plays a key role in addressing these issues. There may be funding cuts ahead. That could put critical programs at risk, including those focused on youth violence prevention, adverse childhood experiences, crisis response, and support for a very much needed workforce. Even with those challenges, one thing is clear. There's still strong bipartisan momentum at both the federal and state levels to address the youth mental health and substance use crisis. And we need to keep that momentum going and work together to make progress, especially now. Now, I'd like to welcome Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota. Since entering the United States Senate in 2018, Senator Smith has championed legislation to expand school-based mental health services, improve crisis response systems, and support the behavioral health workforce. She's a co-founder of the Bipartisan Senate Mental Health Caucus, a member of BPC's honorary congressional working group that has worked with our Youth Mental Health and Substance Use Task Force. Senator Smith, please take the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. And congratulations for making it through the very onerous security lines. I'm so sorry. I was telling Margaret that a couple of times I have actually taken the radical step of holding my meetings outside because it was clear that folks were not going to make it into the building in time. So I'm just really grateful to all of you. I'm grateful to Margaret and to the Bipartisan Policy Center for your work to continue to try to find that place where across lines of party difference we can find places where we do agree in order to make progress for the American people. And it's wonderful to be here with Governor Beshear and Governor Kasich. Thank you so much for your continued relentless focus on the issue of health care and mental health care. And to my colleague, Senator Tillis, who I don't believe is here yet, but I think is joining you shortly. And I particularly want to say hello and send greetings to the caregivers and especially the youth leaders that are here today to share your perspective on the work that we have ahead of us. So I always start from the place that mental health care is health care, and that the brain and body are connected. It is one person, one body, and mental health and physical health go hand in hand. And I, of course, as I think all of us do, believe that everybody deserves access to the mental health care as well as the physical health care that they need to lead their best, most productive, and happy lives. I think that health care is a human right and it should be available to everyone. And I also know that there is a really important need to focus particularly on youth mental health. Now, this is something that I believe has become much more on the national consciousness as we have lived through and then emerged from the COVID pandemic. But of course, we don't fool ourselves that this is driven by what happened during the pandemic. It's stunning to me to think that in 2023, more than 5.3 million adolescents, which is nearly 20% of the young people in our country, had a diagnosed mental or behavioral health condition, whether it be anxiety or depression or some other challenge. So we do have a mental health, behavioral health crisis on our hands in this country. When I was a young person, I struggled with depression myself. And it was hard for me to share that story when I came to the Senate. There is still very much, I think, a stigma that mental health is a sign of weakness, and to be able to say explicitly, as somebody who is perceived to have some amount of power and stature in this society, that I too have experienced a mental health challenge, I think has helped to, it's actions, I took that action in order to try to break down some of that stigma and sort of denial that exists. I was just talking with one of our interns who is here today, who has made this her focus in school, and she talked particularly about some of the challenges in the Black community of sort of saying, I'm fine, everything is good, I've got this, and not being able to, this is of course not unique to any community, it is something that I think is real for all communities. And so understanding that and then figuring out how to break down those barriers to access to care is really, I think, a big part of what we need to be talking about. The other thing, Governor Beshear mentioned this, and I wholeheartedly agree, is that we think about the continuum of care that we provide, but we can't just start at treatment. We have to start at prevention. And early intervention, and then treatment and therapy, and of course, recovery. That whole continuum we have to be addressing. And we have a ways to go. There is no doubt about it. But I have seen progress in this area. And in a moment where I think, in this moment where it's important to be seeing the opportunities as well as the challenges, I think of some of the school-based programs that I've seen in my home state of Minnesota, in Minneapolis and in St. Paul and in Rochester, Minnesota, where there are school-based programs that are completely integrated and coordinated into the ongoing work that's happening at school, so that a student can walk in and without any hoopla and start to figure out what to do. Maybe they are in need of some early intervention or prevention work. Maybe that's a door that they're walking through to get access to the treatment and care and therapy that they need. That gives me so much hope. And also, Congress has worked on this area, and I think we've done some good work in recent years to try to expand access to resources for mental health care, especially for young people. And I think, let's just be direct, right now we need to be doing everything we can to protect that work. We need to be going forward, not backwards. And I'm quite concerned that the budget cuts that are being discussed right now will have a direct impact on the mental health care that we're able to provide, and also a direct impact on the research that is ongoing in universities and other places all around the country to understand what more we can do. A month or so ago, I was at an event with the Minnesota NAMI affiliate talking about the powerful research that's happening through the University of Minnesota and how important it is that that NIH funding doesn't just stop and therefore jeopardizing the incredible research and hopeful research that's happening, including for severe mental illness, which, as we all know, often first shows itself when you are 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. I want to say a word about Medicaid, because I understand that Medicaid was a lively topic of conversation this morning. I think we also need to remember that Medicaid is the single largest health insurance payer for mental health care in the United States, and of growing importance for substance use treatment. And it is vitally important that in this conversation about how cuts to Medicaid might proceed, which I hope that they don't, I'm working hard to make sure that they don't, that we think about the impact that that would have on mental health care as well. So let me just close by thanking you all so much for being here. I want to also close where I started by acknowledging that this is an area of bipartisan interest. I'm very proud to be working on this with my colleagues, Senator Tillis and Senator Padilla and Senator Ernst. The four of us are the bipartisan Senate Mental Health Caucus leads. I know that these conversations today will help to build solidarity around the importance of protecting and expanding access to mental health care, especially for young people, and that the advocacy that is happening here today and the building out of ideas that needs to happen will be really important. I look forward to hearing what comes of your day. I'm very grateful for your sustained interest in this, and thanks so much for inviting me to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Really appreciate your leadership and dedication and for being here with us. And I really appreciate your understanding of the critical roles that our schools play. I'm now pleased to kick off our first panel with two leaders who understand this issue from the state and federal level. Governor Steve Beshear, a former governor of Kentucky and longtime public servant, and Governor Kasich, a former governor of Ohio and member of Congress. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Yes, that's you. We all want to hear you. All right, well, it's terrific for you all to be with us this morning, and thank you for your leadership of the BPC Commission. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the report, I'd like to ask you, how did you come to this issue in the first place? Why do you have such a heart for it? What is it that motivated your willingness to participate in the discussion that we're having today? Governor?
Well, you know, as governor, you deal with health care, education, roads, just the basic things. And health care has become one of the premier issues in our country over the last few years. And part of health care is behavioral health, mental health. And it's been amazing that for years, it's sort of considered separate from the regular healthcare system. And the last time I looked, this head is connected to the body, and you know, and so it all works together. And you know, seeing the statistics in recent years about suicide, about depression, all of those kinds of things, particularly in young people, and the social media balloon that's just blown up. It's really concerning about our future, and I know it's a cliche, but the kids are our future, and we've got to pay attention to bringing those children up in a way that they're going to be productive members of society. So that's the way I got into it, and you know, it's an ongoing problem.
Governor Kasich?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you I love this guy. He's a very, very good man. And he's got a son who's doing a great job in Kentucky. I don't know how many of you know of him, but you're going to hear a lot more about him. I don't really know when. I've been interested in this, it seems like forever. And when I look at people who are struggling with, here's the good news is, I think if we get involved early, people can resolve their problems. If we delay, you know, then they're going to struggle. And for anybody who's struggling with any kind of health issue, something you have to pay attention to. So if you have an opportunity to do something, go ahead and do it. And so, Margaret, I don't know, it's been many, many years, and I'm involved with you and the Meadows Foundation and Nationwide Children's, which has an incredible program. I work with them, and also with a company that's developing technology to help people be able to, an app that can actually help people to be able to lower the intensity of whatever is affecting them. We've made progress. Somebody told me back, I remember in the old days when I was trying to do the budget here, it was very frustrating, and the guy gave me a saw, and he said, just keep sawing. And I think the same is true on this issue. It's complex, but it's solvable. And my biggest thing on this now, my greatest passion, is to integrate behavioral health with primary care and pediatric care. And I think that's the biggest thing we can do to get on the right road to making real progress in terms of addressing the problem.
Governor Beshear, one of the things that the report really speaks to is the need for better coordination across agencies, across funding streams between the state and federal government and the various investments there. Talk about that need for coordination and what you've seen in Kentucky.
Well, as we all know, funds come from a variety of sources, and there's never enough for some of the things that we want to do. And if you don't coordinate, you lose because there's not really enough money in many ways to focus and do the things in mental health that we want to do. And so you got to make the most of what you've got. And honestly, you know, we're facing some real challenges right now, as you all mentioned, as Senator mentioned, with the Medicaid budget, with money flowing from the Safer Communities Act that we just saw that the Education Department said they're going to, I think, cut $1 billion in grants next year, which was directed toward the schools. So we've got to really pull together. We've got to coordinate better, and we've got to have more flexibility. Because if indeed that amount of money is going to go like this, you know, that we've got to deal with this problem, then number one, we've got to coordinate better between places like schools and pediatric care and the Medicaid budget to try to be as flexible and get as much out of that dollar as we can.
Governor, I know you worked on those issues in Ohio and I think had some successes with the coordinating of your resources. Talk about that.
Well, we didn't really have a big challenge on that. My people that, you know, I've talked to them just in the last week because I knew you were going to ask me this question. And they said, look, we didn't have a problem. But it was always, like Steve says, there's never really enough money, which is why I expanded Medicaid. I would say that, look, I like this report because it basically says two things. Let's look at what's working and keep it going. And let's get rid of that doesn't work. And the more we can pull things together and have, you know, GAO or whoever it is to be able to analyze all this and figure out where we are, I think that makes a lot of sense. So it's accountability and support. Get rid of that doesn't work, emphasize that does, better coordination, fewer strings, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. One of the things that we're all, as parents and educators, really concerned about now, you mentioned it, Governor Beshear, is social media and the role that technology plays as a piece of this problem. Talk about that as you led the commission, the federal role in overseeing those things and the role families play, states. I mean, just give us your take on the whole social media.
My first take is I'm glad you've got young people that are going to be on panels because they know a lot more about this than I do. You know, we grew up in a world that didn't have that, and now we're dealing with it. And one of the things we've got to do is educate adults and educate parents about what this is all about and about how to manage it with their kids more, because the kids understand it. They understand it very quickly. I know there's a great balance between freedom of speech and the whole thing and messing with the private sector, but we've got to work together to do some things to better manage what is out there in terms of what it's doing to our children. Because we know stories every day of kids that end up in a bad way because of stuff that they are seeing on the internet. And I don't know all the answers. I don't know how to do it necessarily, although Congress has been up here wrestling with that some. And while we're not there, the conversation is really elevated on that particular area. So we got to keep pushing on that and come up with some solutions that give some guidance to both adults as well as the kids on how you manage this.
Governor, what advice do you have for your former colleagues on this?
You know, when I come here, I break out in a cold sweat and want to go home. But I'm not going to change what I say on television or in speeches or not in this town. I'm going to say it here. It's absolutely absurd that Kids Online Safety Act, which passed the Senate with like 3 votes against it and never passed the House. The problem today, Margaret, is how does campaign finance reform fit into this? But as we have destroyed the ability of the political parties to fundraise and screen and promote the right people for public office, now the special interests do it all. You want to run for office, you go line up your special interests. They're the ones that killed the bill over in the House, no question about it. And some of them are legitimate concerns, like Steve says, I'm sure. But come on, it passes over here with 3 votes against it, and it gets stuck over there. It's nonsense. Either we want to put the kids forward or we don't, and any of these issues can be resolved. And speaking of resolving issues, I want to say one other thing I said earlier today. I love what Steve said, by the way, about prevention, that whole stream that you laid out there, Steve. But I think, we focus on Medicaid. I think we need to have, I don't know why the president doesn't do it. I don't know why the Senate leadership doesn't do it. But we should get everybody involved in the healthcare system in a room. And people who can show up in a room who are not carrying in a bias. People who are providers, whether they're doctors, whether they're hospitals, we need insurance companies, we need the pharmaceutical people. Get them in a room and do a whole analysis of healthcare in this country, including Medicaid and Medicare, which are Medicare going bankrupt, Medicaid, under all this pressure, and figure out how we can have a healthcare system that keeps people healthy rather than having incentives to treat them when they're sick. And I just don't understand why that doesn't happen. A comprehensive plan. We got Obamacare, which was an answer to one of the problems that we had, which was basically to make sure that everybody had coverage. But this idea of a comprehensive reform that would include things like behavioral health is something that's really, really needed. Now, you can't have a bunch of people that are, in there who have a bias. Get honest people in there and think this through and do something, because this healthcare system is cratering, and it includes our behavioral health issues.
Do you want to comment on that, other than saying amen?
Let's sing together. Oh, amen. No, you're exactly right.
Seriously, you put somebody like Bashir on that, you got to get the right people in the room. If you get people who are intellectually honest to go in a room and say, yeah, you're right about that, like including the insurance industry, I mean, my goodness, you imagine answering the phone and you have to turn some lady down that needs a treatment for cancer, and you're saying no? I mean, what do you do when you go home? I mean, some should be said no to, right? But at the other hand, we're all human beings. We're all in the same rowboat. We all believe in a higher power. Almost all of us do. All right, let's put our best foot forward and let's fix things.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to change the channels to the role our schools play, because as complicated as the health system is, really our schools, because of, we know where to find them, we know where, where the kids are and so forth. And so they have become kind of a central focal point for delivery of services, as you know. So let's talk about the role that our schools play, our teachers and counselors play, the paucity of support that we have for some of those services for kids. Just give us your take on the role of schools in this discussion.
Well, as we all know, other than parents, and sometimes even more than parents, the school system and the teachers have our kids more hours every day than any place else. So if nothing else, it makes practical sense to utilize the school systems as one of the focal points when you're trying to address mental health issues. Plus, for the most part, our teachers out there are great, great people. And boy, you talk about a tough job for very little money. They ought to be being paid more than a lot of these CEOs out here. But they know. I still remember as governor, I was talking to a first grade teacher, and we were talking about preschool. And I'm trying to get preschool for everybody. Now, why are you against that? Well, we won't go into that. But trying to do that, and she said, Governor, I can take you into my first grade class today, and I can point out to you the ones that are going to make it and the ones that are not, because I can already see it. The ones that didn't have any kind of preschool education, I mean, they're smart. Our teachers are good, and they want to help these kids, and they do. But we've got to give them more resources to do that. Now in Kentucky, I'm proud of some of the things we've done. We've got these resource centers in every school that help deliver mental health services to the kids as they come along. And we've done great things on the treatment end. Our you know, my name's Steve Bashir, but now I'm known as Andy's dad. You know,
That's all
because
right.
He's governor now. Oh, I kind of like it. I kind of like it. You don't take on any of the responsibility, and you know, he's got to do it all. But he just announced the other day that we've had the third straight year of reduction in opioid overdose deaths. And this last year was 30% reduction. So that's great. We got more treatment beds than we've ever had. That's great. But we've got to do even more on the front end. That is where not only most of these kids can benefit the most, but it's where we can save money in the long run and get into prevention and early detection and early treatment. And the school system is the appropriate place to do a lot of that.
Yeah. Governor, talk about
Other portals are such that, you know, it's a great way to talk about many services. And there's a growing movement to do that. But, you know, Margaret, the problem we have is we don't have enough providers. I've tried
Exactly.
to urge I think in K through 12, and the counselors at the universities, the community colleges, there's a lot of young people, if they were exposed to the opportunity in behavioral health. And you don't need to be a psychiatrist, you don't need to be a psychologist, you can be a social worker. There are a whole series down that line of, depending on the seriousness of what you're dealing with, there's a whole series of things that people can do to contribute. But I don't think we do enough to let young people know what the opportunities are up there to be a provider. And the schools are great, but you know, how much more burden do you put on a teacher? And are we going to train them in addition to that? But this is solvable. This is something we can make progress on. I don't have any doubt, but we just have to let young people know that it could be a fulfilling career. And there is a great burnout factor in this whole area. So you have to make sure you're constantly replenishing those people who are counselors. It's tough work.
Well, one of the potential good things that I've seen in the paper lately, not many, but where they were talking about revising the Pell Grant process.
Yeah.
And I don't know a lot about all the ideas they have, but there was one blurb in there about more Pell Grant money being directed toward technical school and two-year community colleges, and that would be a place where we can generate more of a workforce that could be in the schools with our teachers to help.
Yeah, Governor Kasich, you know, we want to leave folks with an optimistic note about how they can, you know, get involved. I mean, what are the things that you think, where there's more bipartisan energy, that, you know, we can sort of first steps come together around the issues, the many issues that are in here, from health to schools to data to the internet and social media? I mean, what are you more bullish on as you think about this as first things first?
Well, I'm more bullish on what is it we can do where we live. I mean, one of the greatest problems we have in the country today is loneliness. I mean, my wife, she has this thing she visits, I think it's a mission, she visits her olds. These are older people who are lonely, don't have anything, but turn it the other way. Did I read a statistic the other day? I've been told this is true. I find it hard to believe that 25% of adults cannot read.
Yeah,
If
it is true.
you can't read, you
It is
can't
true.
be successful,
It is
okay?
true.
Well, why don't we get involved in literacy in our community, like Tony Kriz does, who's a man from Portland, does a great job. Why don't we get involved in, I know down in Kentucky right now, they're looking at what we can do in foster care. There are people down there trying to, in the private sector, the faith community, involving themselves with the government of Kentucky. The fact of the matter is, instead of always, who would you miss more if they went on vacation? The Secretary of State or your trash man? Okay? And so my view is, why don't you figure out what you can do in the community while you're worried about all this stuff going on here? What are we doing where we live to try to shine a bright light and help solve problems? That, to me, is where I am these days, because I'm already in this cold sweat from being here for 3 hours.
Okay, this is the optimistic note you're leaving us on, Governor.
I'm going to tell you, I'm not so worried about this. I think if we do things from the bottom up rather than top down, that's how that's where America's strength is. And I believe we are ready to drive things from the bottom up not just the top down. And, you know, this thing about, what's it called, hands off, the big rallies going, I say to people, fine, if you want to participate in that, but what are you going to do on Monday? So let's get involved in our communities, whether it's loneliness, whether it's tutoring, whether it's literacy, whether it's just spending time with kid. You know, all that stuff makes a difference, and the Lord's watching.
Governor Beshear?
How do you follow that? He is watching.
He is.
Yeah.
And you know, in my mind, and I think in the minds of most people now, we've finally reached the point to where we can talk about healthcare being a human right, and that every person deserves basic quality healthcare, including behavioral healthcare. And I'm hopeful, I'm terrified and hopeful at the same time about this year in terms of what's going to happen budget-wise, what's going to happen to the Medicaid program. My God, Medicaid has pulled us up by the bootstraps in Kentucky. When I expanded Medicaid, like John did in Ohio, in the first 15 months, we had 500,000 people sign up that had never had health care before. And so that told you the pent-up demand for health care out there. And I think we've got to pull together and put pressure on everybody up here, Democrats and Republicans alike, and challenge them to take off those damn partisan glasses that they wear up here all the time and be human beings first, be Americans first, and be Republican and Democrat second or third or fourth, or maybe not at all. And just keep in mind who we're dealing with. We're dealing with our children.
Yeah.
That's the future of this country. And so I think at the end of the day, hopefully, we can minimize the damage, you know, that could be done to some of our programs, and at the same time find little avenues like the Pell Grant Avenue for more workers in the schools, those kinds of things that can expand what we can do for our kids.
Wow, thank you all for your terrific leadership. And we are so blessed to have you all here with us today to give those really inspiring words for us to act on every day. So thank you.
Thanks for working on
Thank
this
you
stuff,
both.
Yeah.
Margaret.
We're not going to quit. We're not going to
with
quit.
the whole thing, because you're a doer, and you know, you can always have an organization that has meetings and drinks coffee, but I think this is an organization that does. So thank you for
We appreciate that, and thank you. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce Michelle Gazda after we thank our precious governors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Okay, all right, that's it, yeah, okay, good. Okay, yeah, no, thank you very much.
Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you, Margaret, for the introduction, and thank you, Governors Beshear and Kasich, for your leadership and unwavering commitment. I also want to thank the members of the Bipartisan
what's the
Policy
deal
Center's
with,
Youth Mental Health and Substance Use Task
tell
Force
us.
for your dedication to this critical effort. I'm here to briefly share what we've accomplished together through this national initiative, which we launched in January of 2024 to tackle one of the most urgent challenges facing youth and families today. We're all familiar with the headlines: rising rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, and substance use among adolescents and young adults. The task force began with a clear goal: to develop actionable, bipartisan policy solutions grounded in the real experiences of young people and families. To do that, we convened a diverse group of former government officials, like the governors you just heard from, policy experts, and individuals with firsthand experience. Over the past year, we've worked closely with them, and many of you in this room, to identify where federal policy can drive real change. The result is a set of concrete policy recommendations for Congress and the administration focused on 3 key areas: healthcare delivery system redesign, aiming to strengthen the workforce, enforce screening and treatment requirements, integrate behavioral health into primary care, address the needs of high acuity youth, and expand access to crisis and stabilization services. Prevention, early identification, and intervention, seeking to improve federal resources, coordination between the healthcare system and child welfare, school and military systems, and cross-system collaboration to enhance access to early intervention services for at-risk youth. And finally, safe and secure social media, focusing on boosting a federal approach to children's online safety through social media literacy, privacy protections, transparency and oversight, and research on how social media affects youth mental health and substance use. Across all of our work, we've heard one message again and again. Youth and families shouldn't have to navigate a fragmented, reactive system to get help. That means breaking down federal silos, investing in prevention, and empowering states and communities to lead with innovation. But we can't do it alone. The task force represents just one part of a growing national movement to ensure every young person has the opportunity to thrive. We're grateful to work alongside so many of you, and we look forward to continuing this effort together. It is now my pleasure to introduce our lovely second panel. We have Sema Skyer, who is the president and CEO of Sergo Health, and our lovely panelists that she will introduce. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Awesome, great. Well, that was such an inspiring panel to follow, but this is going to be even more inspiring. I'm really excited to be here today. Let me take the opportunity to introduce our amazing panelists. So we have Zoe Ilgenfritz. Awesome. Zoe is a pre-med student here at George Washington University. She's also a dedicated crisis text line volunteer, and where she supports individuals in emotional distress. She's also an advocate on campus to expand access to mental health resources and peer support. Welcome, Zoe. So nice to have you. Second, we have Michael Schmidt. Michael is an administrative coordinator at Recover Revolution and a certified peer specialist, bringing lived experiences in addiction and recovery to his advocacy work. He also serves as a youth advisor on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Youth Mental Health and Substance Abuse Task Force, and Michael is 5 years sober. Welcome, Michael. And finally, we have Sophie Chev. Awesome. This has been the most stressful part of this panel, getting the last names right. And Sophie's a Stanford student and a nationally recognized youth mental health advocate who serves on SAMHSA's National Advocacy Council and as a youth advisor as well at the Bipartisan Policy Center's Youth Mental Health and Substance Abuse Task Force. Sophie helped secure historic youth mental health investments in California and was named to Forbes 2025 30 under 30 in social media. Welcome. It's really humbling to be part of this panel, so I'm very, very excited. This is a really important moment for us for a number of reasons. My organization, Sergo Health, we actually recently launched one of the largest trackers of youth experiences in the US, so really trying to understand from their perspectives, their mental health and well-being, as well as the recent report from the Bipartisan Centers on the policy recommendations. One of the things that I think is really important is how do we bring youth voices into this conversation? And so on this panel, we want to hear directly from you all, because I think you have so much to share and so much for us to learn from. So I'm going to start with the question, given where we are today, if you are sitting from a member of Congress right now, across from a member of Congress, what would you describe as the experience of seeking care for mental health and substance abuse? And what would you like different? What would you like to have seen changed? So maybe Zoe, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd want people to know is that seeking mental health support doesn't necessarily have to be something that's complicated. A lot of times people have an idea that you need to give a 10-step plan or you need to know exactly what to say. You need to have the young person leave with some sort of solution. But a lot of times, I think the best support is just coming from validation. A lot of times, I'll take texters that come to crisis text line, and within the first minute of the conversation, they will try to leave. and they'll tell me that they are burdening me and that it's not a real crisis and I'm wasting my time by talking to them. And this really couldn't be further from the truth. And kind of with that, I always make sure that I let them know that I'm here for them. A crisis is a crisis, no matter how big or how small. And we work with them to kind of figure out next steps, but really just being there for them and supporting them in that moment tends to be the most impactful of anything else.
That's very powerful. Thanks, Zoe. Michael?
Hello? All right. So, yeah, I would definitely say for me, if I say the question again one more time, just so.
If you're sitting across from a member of Congress, what would you like them to know about the experience of seeking mental health or substance abuse care today, and what would you like to see changed?
Okay. So I'm 25 now. When I entered recovery, I was 20 years old, right? And I always say, like, substance use and mental health, they go hand in hand, right? I was definitely, why was I using substances, right? Because I wasn't, I was coping with something. I was kind of like self-medicating. What would I say? I am a huge advocate for like the peer support services sort of aspect of things, meaning that I remember when I was, in active addiction, the doctor told me, hey, Mike, if you continue living like this, you're probably going to die, right? Just be blunt about it, right? My mom would say, if you keep living like this, if you keep doing what you're doing, I mean, like, you're going to die, X, Y, and Z, right? Like, name the above, right? So on top of being somebody actually in recovery, I'm also a loved one of someone in, recovery. So my sister actually entered recovery before me, and I used with my sister from a young age. And why I bring that up is because that was the peer aspect for me, because my sister entered recovery, and I saw what her life turned into after, going into treatment and doing, and just following, this kind of like, following her peers that helped her. I feel like I'm yelling, but I would definitely say, peer support is very important, right? Because eventually, I got honest with her. I was like, listen, Jess, which is my sister's name, I need help. And so she was able to help me get into treatment and show me like what it was like when I got there. I didn't have to go through it alone because she's been there and done that. And after she helped me get into a recovery home, which is, a big thing that Recover Revolution does. We do recovery homes, right? But having that peer support in the recovery home helped me, begin to find a new way to live through a recovery. So peer support is 100% what I'm for.
I love that, Mike. We're going to come back to that point a little bit later again. Sophie, I'd love to hear from you.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think this peer support aspect is very important. I know we'll circle back to it. But one thing...
We'll stay with it.
Oh, yeah. No, totally. But one thing I did want to highlight from the previous panel as well is that some of the progress that we really tend to highlight right now is that we are framing healthcare as a human right. And that is so important. If your sister did not have access to that treatment, she might not be alive today. We can talk about healthcare as a human right until we're blue in the face, and we should. But we need to move beyond that and start talking about healing as human nature. That healing happened when you were able to reach out to your sister and reach out for help. That healing happens when people text you and you provide that care for them as a peer. Healing happens in community. It happens when we blur the lines between taking care of ourselves and taking care of the systems that support us to make them better serve us. And I think that's something I really want to emphasize today for the people that have the power to change the policies that impact our healthcare, is that we as young people are receiving that healthcare, but a lot of times it feels very hierarchical. You are receiving this care as a patient and you have a provider, and that is needed. But we also need to be able to think about ourselves as healers, think about ourselves not as productive citizens, but as members of communities that can contribute, that can receive, and can help with that healing. Because a lot of us, the very reason why we struggle with these mental health concerns is because we see a broken and sick world, and we need to be able to envision ourselves healing for it in order for us to heal as well.
Okay, we're going to stick with peer support and community because I think you all bring an important point. Let's talk a little bit more about that because Zoe, you talked about when someone reaches out being able to acknowledge the moment and continue. Mike, you talked about peer And then Sophie, you talked about community. What should that look like? Does it need to be formalized? Do we need to train peers? Like, can you dive a little bit deeper in terms of? I know you're part of a crisis text line team. You're a volunteer, so that's something you do. But what should this look like, and how could it be part of the broader health system, or should it be part of the broader health system?
I can kick us off. Young people are already doing this healing. This is something I've said before. I am so thankful to have a seat at this table. I'm really glad to see other young people having a seat at this table. We have gotten very used to feeding each other on the floor. So come on the floor with us and see how that healing is happening and help us acknowledge that we are already doing it. For me, that healing happened when I was in the hospital and struggling with an eating disorder. I was in a system of care that was not set up to care for me. I was told that my body mass index was considered too high to receive proper care, and that I would have 2 weeks left to live despite being in multi-organ failure. That was healthcare. It was not healing. What was healing was being able to exchange letters with my poetry teacher at the time, speak about my experiences, speak about the injustices that I witnessed, and learn about the injustices that those in community with me and those who I was not in community with were experiencing as well. That is what healing is. She was a healer. If people, and young people especially, are able to conceptualize of the work they are already doing, whether that be writing poetry, whether that be babysitting, whether that be talking to friends, working at a crisis text line, spending time outside in a park and sitting and talking with your friend who's struggling or who's grieving, that is contributing to healing. And I think young people need to be able to see that and have that language, because right now a lot of us feel very disempowered, but that power really comes from what we are already doing.
Very powerful. Mike?
I mean, like, honestly, like, what popped into my head of this again, like, having incentives for peers, right? And kind of like, again, like, the only thing I could do is share my experience, right? And then, my experiences when I went to therapy, when I went to psychiatrists, when I went to all like the outpatients, whatever it was, I never, kind of like, I never got it. I never wanted to hear it. And it wasn't until like I actually kind of jumped into this like recovery community and I saw recovery happening like all around me, different types of people. I've met people that, at the age of 30, entered recovery, they couldn't read and they graduated with master's degrees, right? Like that gets me, like I've met college professors that used to smoke crack, right? And like now they're a college professor. Like for me, that's recovery, that's healing, right? That's seeing somebody, going like coming from where you were at. And because obviously, there of course, like stigma is like dying out, but stigma's still there, right? So the old adage of like, somebody, struggling with mental health, someone, once an addict, always an addict, right? So sort of that aspect of things where, you kind of write yourself off, right? Because, society tells you otherwise. But something like I also like kind of popped up based off like what Sophie was saying of healthcare, right? Of, and I was like talking about this the other day where it's like, a lot of not a lot, but like a good amount of times, like I'm helping somebody get into treatment, right? Because in this whole like aspect of like peer work, like we're a community, right? So if I can't help, like I may know somebody who can, right? And I can connect you, right? Because they understand, right? We're not going to ask you for a copay card, right? We're going to help you because like it's personal, it's not business for us when it comes to this, because we've been there, we've done that, and we're passionate about it because we saw how it changed our lives. But there's plenty of times when like, it's sad, but like I have to ask somebody, what kind of insurance do you have? Do you have private insurance or Medicaid, right? Because if you have private insurance, I could get you into treatment today, no problem. If you have Medicaid, I may not be able to get you in for a day or two, a couple of days. And I always say like like you got to strike when the iron's hot when it comes to the willingness, right? So that's, I heard before, like, kind of having more access to treatment, right? That's important, right? Because that one night could be people are going to die because of that, because I've seen it happen, right? All it takes is one. And, I've seen it.
Yeah, that makes sense. How did you become a peer educator yourself?
Because it's personal, it's not a business for me. That's the best way I could say it. I don't necessarily know if I'd be a peer educator. I'm a peer, meaning that like, I've been there, I've done that, and I could help somebody, by sharing my experience, right? Because I've been there, I've done that, I understand where you're at, and I know that there's a way out.
Yeah, thank you. Zoe, love to hear from you.
I actually kind of want to piggyback a little bit off of what Mike said about being there and doing that. A lot of people at Crisis Text Line decided to start volunteering because they've dealt with things on their own. That's why I started. I've always kind of been the therapist in my friend group, and I wanted to be able to kind of share that with my friends and or with people that I help, besides just my friends. And I feel really fortunate that at Crisis Text Line, I'm given 15 hours of training to be the best peer supporter that I can be, but also that's not realistic for a lot of people, whether it be they don't have enough time to volunteer or what it be. But I don't think that's necessarily what we need. I don't think everybody needs that much training. I think what we need is awareness and kind of destigmatizing mental health care, so that people don't think that it's their fault if they're feeling a certain way. I remember I was talking to my boyfriend recently, and he mentioned about being depressed in high school and wondering, like, why was this his fault? And that's not the case. And having someone who's lived through that and knowing that you can relate to them and they can hear you out and know that it's not your fault and it's okay really, really means so much. And so kind of also with that awareness, even just sort of like education, as Sophie said too, our peers are already supporting each other. For a lot of people, that's their first line of defense, is talking to your best friend or your sibling. So if we can just give them some sort of materials just to kind of be better at what they're already doing, I think that would be amazing.
You all talked about accessing care at some point, right? So I think the peer and the community is really powerful as a first line support. But then at some point, maybe perhaps people need to access care. One of the things we found in our data is one out of three people that need care, youth, actually don't access care, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm curious from your own experiences, whether it's yourselves or the peers that you're working with, what kind of barriers are you seeing in terms of that really prevents people from accessing the care that they need? Whether it's substance abuse care or mental health care. Yeah, Mike, if you want to go first, and then we'll come to you.
I remember, because I started using at a young age. I started using at the age of 12, right? And a big part, I started off using kind of like high. I would take a little something from my dad. My mom and dad split up, so like I would go back home, and my mom worked 2 jobs, so I lived at my grandparents a lot of the time. And I would, get high. And I didn't want anybody to know because I didn't want to be labeled as, a drug addict, right? I was afraid of being labeled as that. Growing up throughout school, like it's funny because eventually I did get in trouble at school and I got drug tested and they made me go to an IOP. And although that was my first taste of what recovery could be like, for me, I remember, being like, where did all my friends go? Because a big part of socializing, I'm 25 now. I mean, I can't imagine it's changed much, as far as I don't know anybody my age. I mean, obviously I know you guys, but I don't know anybody my age, right? Because everybody my age, how do they socialize? They go out to the bar, they drink, they smoke weed, they do whatever they do. I can't, I don't live like that. And I remember in high school, being all my friends, it was all surrounded by substance use. So I, was trying to, enter recovery, and I didn't have any people because all my social network, that's what it was surrounded around. So that's I guess I would say that's a big barrier of being afraid of being the odd one out, being or not, having to be isolated. So I heard somebody mention, loneliness, right? One of my favorite sayings is the opposite of addiction is connection, right? Because addiction for me, when I isolate myself, that's when I could, kind of talk to myself in that voice that who knows what would happen, right? But yes, absolutely.
Yeah, That's so interesting. We talk about stigma of seeking care, but in this case, it's the stigma of not being in your community. Interesting. Zoe, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think something else that's definitely going to be a big barrier is kind of just feeling overwhelmed and really not knowing where to go, or not knowing if you can afford things. I know this actually hits pretty close to home. I've always been very in touch with my emotions, and I've kind of been dealing with my mental health from a very young age. So I've gotten very good at kind of self-coping strategies. But around a year and a half ago, I kind of had everything in my life come together at once and kind of just send me down a really terrible mental health spiral. And I kept pushing it off, and I kept saying that I would be able to deal with it on my own. And a few weeks later, I found myself underneath one of the tables in my study hall at my school, shaking and hyperventilating and not knowing what to do. And one of my really good friends found me and tried to help me look for kind of like immediate places to go. And at the time, for whatever reason, we didn't really think about a Google. We thought about things that were immediately there on my campus. So I had two options. I could either go to a psychiatry appointment that I would have to pay $80 for, which was not feasible because part of the reason I was freaking out was because I was having financial struggles. Or I could go to the free therapy program that gave us 6 free visits before we had to be referred to someone else. Or the moment you're diagnosed with something, if they think you have anxiety or depression, they're no longer allowed to treat you, and they have to send you to someone else. And I didn't know if this was considered a real emergency, so I didn't want to take that. And so I ended up not reaching out to anybody, despite however terrible that breakdown, to be honest, was. And I was able to call my best friend, thank God, and she walked me through kind of some of the things that she's been helping me with since I was 12 or 13. And I'm so thankful that I have that support from her, but I think it's also really important to remember that a lot of people don't. So a lot of people don't have those people that they can go to talk to afterwards, and they're just sitting there alone thinking that they have no option to do anything. And so what I think we need to do is we need to kind of create spaces and let people know that there are options out there. I know one thing Crisis Text Line is doing right now is trying to get the phone number on the back of student IDs. And even something as small as that, and just knowing that there is that option, that 24/7 free option for people to go to, I think could make an insane difference.
Yeah, such a simple solution, but so powerful. Thank you. Yeah, Sophie.
Thank you both for bringing up those very real lived experiences. And I think when we're talking about barriers to care, it is important to center those literal barriers that exist. That is happening with cuts to Medicaid. It was happening to things like threats to Section 504. And it would be absolutely remiss for me to sit here and talk about barriers to care without talking about those actual policy barriers we need to address. With that being said, I think something that we think about in terms of eliminating barriers to care is eliminating stigma. And a lot of that does come from the incredible bravery of people like the senator that was able to stand up here and say that she struggled with depression. I think that's very powerful. You two sitting up here and talking about your mental health struggles, that is so powerful. But something that Zoe just pointed to that I really want to emphasize is that labels can not only help you access care, they can also block you away from care. And we really need to rethink that. When I was younger, I grew up with a learning disability. I really struggled with my motor skills. I may or may not have been diagnosed with learning disability, but I was labeled as someone that was struggling. That label helped me access the support that I needed. If I was a kid of color, that label would have put me down a very different path. I would have been labeled as dangerous. We need to really think about these labels in context, and we need to dive into that history, need to dive into the policies that we can use to make it so that these labels actually don't block people from care. And that's because a lot of people receiving care is contingent on them receiving it in the first place. People should have access to care regardless of that. We talked about people receiving care when preventatively, that's also a big, big part of that, is kind of redefining the relationship we place these labels along with who receives care and why and what kind of care that might look like when care is punitive versus when care is uplifting. And I think it's really, really important that we have those conversations because my generation is having that conversation, but we need to be having that intergenerationally.
I'm so impressed with how honest you are and your ability to share your stories and how articulate you all are. It's just really amazing. Thank you for that. I want to ask about, just on this care seeking, the role of parents and if you see any role parents play, and what could that be? And do you feel youth are comfortable talking to their parents, and what are there barriers there in terms of seeking care?
Yeah, I can kick us off. I think this extends beyond parents and just into the general intergenerational conversation, where a lot of us feel like this is kind of veering into a territory of, oh, kids these days and their mental health. And a lot of us feel very misunderstood and not heard. So I think, like, as people who are in older generations, it's very important to open yourselves up to simply listen. And like I said earlier, observe how we're feeding each other on the floor and validate that it's happening and see how you can uplift that. So that's one really important thing. And another thing that I want to highlight with parents and families in general is that a lot of the resources that are available for families and parents don't necessarily fit every single family structure. This is absolutely something I have seen in treatment. It is very, very hard to talk about how to support a kid with an eating disorder when you're struggling to pay the bills and feed your kids in general. So that's why I think it's so important we talk about mental health as an entry point to talk about all other kinds of systems, including housing justice, including food justice. Because once we try to separate that, it becomes so inaccessible for families and parents to really start having those conversations.
Zoe or Michael, any thoughts on that one?
I can go. I think something that is kind of like piggybacking a little bit off of some of what Sophie was saying is kind of teaching parents, or again, just a higher or a slightly older, I hate using that word with people that are older than me, but that generation. Yes, other people. But just teaching them what young people really need. Because I think especially with age comes wisdom. And so a lot of times, I know even when I've reached out to some people, they've tried to give me a logical solution and been like, okay, well, this is what you have to do. And that doesn't really help me. Or I remember going to a teacher when I was younger and having struggles with some like family issues at home. And her response was to bring in my parents and talk about it. And that absolutely wrecked my trust in a lot of adults for a really long time. And so I think what could be really helpful is kind of teaching adults what the youth actually want. All I wanted was to be heard. All I wanted was to be supported. And I think that things would have turned out completely different for me if that did happen. And also, I think, also with what Sophie was saying about like kids these days, I think it's also important that other people also take care of their own mental health. I think a lot of times, especially for some older individuals, they see mental health as a weakness and won't give themselves self-care time because they think that makes them lesser. And I think just with that alone, they're not able to give as helpful care as they would be able to if they actually took care of themselves.
Thank you. So I'm going to pivot to a topic that came up in the previous panel, which is social media. It's a big one, as we all know. I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what is your relationship with social media? And do you feel there's a need or there are ways to make that experience healthier for you and your peers?
I mean, like, I would say I definitely have like somewhat of an interesting relationship with social media. You know, it's a little bit too long for like a 2-minute window or like a minute window, but like I would definitely say, social, I mean, like, even like regarding like substance use, I would say like social media, there's a lot of glorification, like, glorifying, like, especially like in music and social media kind of like go hand in hand. There's a lot of like glorifying substance use, or even glorify, I mean, like, and again, like glorifying like mental health, sort of where like some music like just kind of like making like maybe like depression or like addiction seem cool. Like that was me growing up, like, listening to like these like artists on like SoundCloud or whatever, and being and kind of like justifying my substance use, like justifying taking, my mom's Xanax because I was like, okay, like, Lil Peep is doing it, and so forth. So I would say definitely like education with like social media for sure. You know, being like, because social, like, I feel like I feel like social media like became like a thing like 2007, 2010, and like so forth. Like now it's like so ingrained in like the world today. You got to be careful. I mean, you got to be careful of social media. Again, I don't have much time, but go
No,
on.
that's very interesting. So anything different that you would want to see in terms of how social media is provided or regulated or whatever it may be, like in terms of maybe, Sophie, you want to say something?
I can speak to that, yeah. I think a lot of the conversation around social media is centered around the harms. I'm not going to deny that they're there. I downloaded Instagram at 10 years old, and it is absolutely, I was exposed to content I should not have been exposed to. But we're not talking about the reason I was exposed to that content. The reason I was exposed to that content is because the algorithm that allows these platforms to make money is more time spent online equals more money. Therefore, they are incentivized to provide whatever content will make young people spend more time online, whether that be harmful or not. But we have to pair that with the reality that more people in my generation feel safer expressing themselves in online spaces than in person. I will say that again. More young people feel safer expressing themselves online than in person. So I think we really need to talk about the problem is in our real day-to-day lives, not necessarily on social media. Just as healing is part of human nature, communication is part of human nature. We're gonna keep utilizing it. It's not gonna go anywhere. We're gonna keep using social media as a space for healing. So we cannot, and we absolutely should not, when we do implement these safeguards, which are very important, when we do hold these platforms accountable, which we absolutely do, we don't also harm these systems of healing and these systems of advocacy that we have created for each other.
So you're saying the solution is also outside of social media. We have to look what's happening outside that's driving people to find that community in social media. Yeah. And Zoe.
Yes. I know we're slightly running
Oh,
low
yes,
on
we're almost
time,
up for
so
time.
I'll try to make this fast. But I've also had a complicated relationship with social media and ended up deleting it because I found that it was not great for my mental health. And recently I've started kind of reintegrating it a little bit. And I find that some of the best social media is the community-based one. I hate to admit it, but I love going on Reddit, where you anonymously join these communities, and it really allows people to kind of feel like they can find people that relate to them or things that they love. I'm in a soup Reddit, that's one of my favorites, where we share recipes, and a lot of my friends don't necessarily have soup enthusiasm, so it's great to know that there are people out there where I can talk to them about this. And so, I mean, granted, I think people can also use this for more serious matters. But I think kind of just shifting social media focus into community things rather than just an individual, how many likes do I have on a picture? How many comments did I get? Something like this.
I think we all need more community. Thank you so much. It's been so inspiring hearing your voices and your experiences, and so humbling. I am 2 minutes over. I'm getting a lot of signals from over there. So thank you so much. I'm going to now turn it over to Joseph Choi of The Hill to introduce our final panel. No, that's on me. Okay. Sorry, I'm turning it to Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was wonderful. Really appreciate it. It is now my great pleasure to introduce a friend and very important leader in the United States Senate, the senior senator from North Carolina, Senator Thom Tillis. I'm going to say a little matter of personal privilege before he comes up, because this is somebody who keeps the main thing, and he's been a huge champion of these issues and many in education. He and I had the opportunity to work closely together when I was at the University of North Carolina system, and he knows a lot about state government. He's a successful businessman, and now privileged to work in the United States Senate. So, Senator Tillis, off to you.
Well, let's just clear this up really quickly. I'm Tom Tillis, U.S. Senator and a soup enthusiast. I've got a tortellini, a cheese tortellini and sausage andouille that I've cooked in my office in an Instant Pot from the beginning of prep to the meal being cooked, 45 minutes. You want to do that? You can come to my office. We'll do it again. I'm also a all things about solving behavioral health problems enthusiast. How many of y'all have actually had a behavioral health crisis yourself? It was actually transformative for me. It happened in 2007, shortly after I was diagnosed with Wegener's granulomas. And they determined that the course, I was very lucky for one thing, because oftentimes it's a disease that will kill you within about 2 years. It's incurable, but treatable. And they determined that by providing me a less than calm personality to begin with, 90 milligrams of prednisone a day for nearly 90 days. And it produced pharmacologically induced mania. In my first year in the legislature, while I was also a partner at IBM, I stopped hanging around my normal friends. I started going out in the woods a lot. And then after about 6 weeks of pharmacologically induced mania, the regimen is to cut off. It's not like other steroids where you ramp down. It's cold turkey, which then led to 6 weeks of what I would consider to be, well, it was diagnosed by a psychiatrist as a profound depression. So I spent a weekend, never got out of bed. Now, this is while I'm a partner at IBM and a state legislator trying to deal with this and keep everything together. A blessing, because I learned a lot from that experience. For one thing, my illness went into remission. I haven't had any complications since then. It looks like we beat it. But boy, it gave me great insights into what a shitty job people do in terms of dealing with the stigma and caregiving. I can tell you, when I had pharmacologically induced mania and I was like a king of the world, I had people saying, Tom, you just need to calm down. I love being in the woods. I'm in the woods almost every weekend when I'm home, oftentimes by myself. You ought to go hunting. I said, yeah, that's a great idea. Put a gun in my fucking hand. And I'm a gun enthusiast, but that didn't make sense to me. But that was one of the loving, one of the people said, yeah, just go hunting, get out in the woods with a gun. And then I dealt with depression. It's like, yeah, just get over it, man. Maybe go for a run or, go clear a trail. I was a mountain biker or whatever. The bottom line is people really don't understand, and you can't possibly understand. And you may have studied it, so there you can have some empathy, but you can't possibly have sympathy unless you've experienced the emotions that those people are going through. And so we have a lot of work to do. I remember the first time, I haven't gotten to this level of detail, I'm sure my comms guy is freaking out, because after I first shared that story years ago, people said, well, we're not sure if you should lean in so heavy to admitting that you had a behavioral health crisis. I said, did you see what the title of the session was? It was removing the fucking stigma of mental health. So folks, at the end of the day, our brain, has a chemistry that some days is good, other days are bad. People have bad days. We have to understand it, and we have to celebrate the fact that you can manage through it. I've been studying this since 1996 when my grandmother, excuse me, y'all got any water back there? I won't go much longer, but my grandmother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. So I was just finishing my degree. I was 36 years old, a partner at Price Waterhouse, still had to work on a few more credits to get my 4-year degree. Did it at University of Maryland, and I did 2 courses. One was on caregiving for people with Alzheimer's and dementia, and the other one was dealing with death and dying in the grieving process. That just opened my eyes to what, if you think we got work to do as caregivers now, imagine the work we had to do in 1996 when we were basically warehousing people. So I learned. And I had a journey with my grandmother that I cherished because I understood how to become a better caregiver. Not to bring her where I am, but to meet her where she is and try to figure out how I can support her. Very different perspective. Most people don't get it. Smart people think they've got a solution. So we have to work on caregiving, and then now let's get down into the youth community, especially among youth. They're subjected to challenges today that I wasn't subjected to. Loved it. Mom fed me in the summertime. We went off in the woods. Maybe we come back for lunch. We went off in the woods. We came back home for dinner. That was it. Now you got kids on social media. You've got a lot of challenges and a lot of threats. And by the way, the thing that's the source of the problem is also likely the solution to it. So I understand that. But folks, we got to work. If you how many of you watched the limited series on Netflix called Adolescence? Every single one of you should watch it before the weekend to understand that this is something that we have to fix. And I, for one, I've got 3 grandchildren. I, for one, don't want to see their face into a phone before they're 16 years old. Now, if we want a phone that they can call mom, grandmom, or something else, me, grandpa or papa, that's fine. But I think we've got to be really wide-eyed and smart about this. We can legislate till the cows come home, but there's always going to be a vulnerability on their internet. There's always going to be a way for bad people to get to kids. And don't fool yourself into thinking that we can regulate the social media companies into a position where that vulnerability doesn't exist. We also have to remind adults that just because you can say something audacious and threatening on social media, don't screw up and say the same thing to me in my face, because you will get a very different reaction. And I really do believe that there are some people who sometimes now forget when they engage in the public that they're no longer faceless and no longer anonymous. So there's a lot of work to do to hold, I think, society accountable for the way that we use social media. There's a lot of work that we need to do to remove the stigma. There's a lot of work that we need to do to get to these kids early and make sure they have the clinical specialist, not a teacher who's in a classroom to teach. I don't want them to be the counselor for those kids. I want a professional that knows how to treat these kids. And we've got to figure out how to get the resources in there, which is one of the reasons why I was part of leading the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act to get resources into schools to help these children. I'm hearing now that some of the grants are going to be, that have been denied or are being reviewed. I'm going to work with the administration and explain to them how critically important the single largest investment in behavioral health in the history of this country needs to continue to flow. So I'll leave you with this. And I'll leave you with this. Those of you who are we've got to create a best practice. We've got to implement the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act to the full extent. And for those of you who have any connection to North Carolina, I'm calling on you to make North Carolina best practice. I have passion around it. I want to get it done. I want to create more momentum for more states to do it right. And that's not implementing just one section of the bill. It's implementing everything. Because if we do, we're going to have a tremendous impact on behavioral health. So thank you all for letting me speak a little bit today. We can share soup recipes anytime you want to. And know that my office is behind doing everything we can to move the ball along. Thank you all. Thank you, Margaret.
Wow, that was great. All right, time for our final panel. I want to turn it over to our moderator, Joseph Choi of The Hill, who will introduce our panelists. Joseph covers federal health policy, pharmaceutical developments, and health legislation, drawing on a broad background in political and health reporting across national and local news outlets.
Is it on? Cool. And if we could get another round of applause for the previous speakers. They were really great, right? All right. So this last panel will deal with the caregivers and the healthcare providers. We've heard from the government, we've heard from the youth perspective, and now we'll hear from the people who are on the ground, speaking with patients, speaking with people in crises, and helping to treat them. And on our panel today, we have Dr. Scott Hadlin, who is Chief of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine at Mass General and Harvard Medicine. He is a leading expert on youth addiction and mental health. And we also have Angela Kimball, who is Chief Advocacy Officer at the advocacy group Inseparable. And we also have Dr. Laura Willing, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Children's National Hospital here in DC. She also co-directs the Anxiety Disorders Program at the hospital. Thank you for joining us. All right, so to get the conversation started, broadly speaking, what is one policy change each of you would like to see that you feel would make the most amount of impact today when it comes to youth mental health?
All right, I'll dive in. I'll say that one of the most important policy changes that this administration could make is really emphasizing the need to integrate behavioral health care in schools and in pediatric settings. And just to share a little bit about what that looks like, you know, when my son was young, he just didn't respond to everyday life the way other children did. We never knew what would be broken, who might be hurt, or when it would happen. You know, we walked on eggshells every single day. And it was easier for me to believe that I had failed as a mother than to believe that something was wrong with my beautiful baby boy. But he had a teacher at school who pulled me aside one day and said, "Angela, honey, I've taught hundreds and hundreds of kids, and I know when a boy is misbehaving, and I know when something's wrong, and something is wrong. You just keep looking for help. You'll know it when you find it." And I did, and that saved our lives. That was so important. And so that integration of care is really fundamental to getting people the help that they need.
Dr. Willing?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think that it's so important to focus on the young people and the families, really making family-centered, patient-centered priorities available. So one thing we could do is incentivize providers to put a center on the family voice. And what I hear families telling me in my office is that they have to miss a lot of school, right? If you're coming to weekly therapy appointments or monthly psychiatry appointments, the school starts to get a little bit anxious about that. Why are you missing so much school? There's also a lot of focus on school absenteeism. So one thing we could do is to have school-based mental health centers where there are professionals in the schools to provide that care that we know that can be effective. And so then youth and families don't have to miss so much school and so much work.
Thank you. Dr. Hadlin?
Yeah, I really agree with the comments that have been made so far, and I would layer onto it to incentivize the work for the clinicians who are doing this. So I think this is really typified by a patient that I cared for, a young man named Brendan, who was a healthy adolescent, doing quite well. Early in adolescence, his father died of cancer. And despite Brendan doing really well in life, playing for the school baseball team, doing reasonably well in school, when his father died, it was such a trauma for him that he sort of really spiraled into struggling with depression and anxiety. That turned into struggling with substances. And ultimately, he ended up struggling with opioids, with heroin, with fentanyl, and with crystal methamphetamine. And by the time I met him, so I work as a pediatrician caring for adolescents and young adults up to the age of 25 with addiction issues. By the time I met him, he was very deep into addiction. And all along the way, there wasn't an issue that people didn't recognize that he had a problem going on. People identified that he had depression, that he had anxiety, that he had substance use problems, but there was sort of nobody willing or able to kind of take the reins of his care and really spearhead it. Ultimately, Brendan died shortly after the onset of COVID. He was found murdered in a hotel room by somebody that he'd been using drugs with. And the case still really, his story really haunts me to this day because first of all, his killer has never been found. I don't get the sense that anybody is looking for his killer. And it just strikes me that his story is wrapped in so much stigma that at every step of the way there were people who could have helped him but weren't able to invest the time. And when I talked to his mom about this, he shares that people didn't have time, they didn't have the training to do it, and they felt stigmatized when they went to healthcare settings. And so I bring it back to my initial comment, which is that if we could incentivize this work for clinicians to take it on, meaning if we can line up the finances to make it so that it is incentivized for clinicians to care for young people when they're struggling in this way, people will fall in line and do the work. As somebody who leads a group of clinicians and looks at the budget, I know that when I spend an hour talking to a young person who's struggling with opioid addiction, during that exact same amount of time, I could have seen 3 patients with sore throats and made twice as much money for the clinic. That is wrong. That's backwards from how it should be.
Gotcha. Angela, Dr. Willing, y'all both touched on kind of issues within the system of healthcare. Would you be able to expand on kind of the places within where people are trying to find a care where they're kind of run into breakdowns or obstacles, and what other ways we can look to integrate the systems, as Dr. Willing you touched on?
Sure, I can start. I think integrating mental health care, behavioral health care into a variety of spaces, including primary care, is really important. As many people have mentioned today, there is a lot of stigma around mental health care and accessing mental health care that is really creating an unnecessary barrier to wellness. I am so impressed with the young people today that are sharing their lived experience. It's really remarkable. And they're really brave for doing that. And everyone should be able to talk about their experiences without feeling stigma or feeling like they might be judged. So one way to change the system is to have mental health care, behavioral health care be integrated into primary care offices. So that could be co-located psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists in the office. But there are also a lot of systems of care that we know that they work. One example is the collaborative care model. And that's a model where you can have a behavioral health care manager work directly with the pediatrician with some input from a psychiatrist to help reach a lot more people. And then because you have all the right people at the table taking care of that pediatrician's entire panel of patients, you're able to identify which patients need more care, a higher level of care, and refer them to the psychiatrist or the psychologist, which also helps every patient, every family get the right level of care. And it's a good use of resources.
Angela, as a caregiver, what was your experience, seeking care for your son?
There is so much that is challenging about trying to access care and integration of care. I would love to have experienced that when my son was young. But I think another barrier that we don't talk enough about is the need to have insurers, whether it's Medicaid or commercial insurance, cover early help, including before there's actually a diagnosis for a child. I knew my son was struggling long before there were behaviors that resulted in a diagnostic label of bipolar disorder. And how wonderful would it have been to be able to get help early? Because people with early help can learn to effectively manage what I'll call neurodiversity, brains that may be wired a little bit differently. And we all in a family need to learn how to best support an individual to be their best self. And getting that help early is so critical to that. And yet, most therapists aren't paid unless there is a formal diagnosis. That is the kind of rules that we need to blow up and start over, and really nurturing what we're talking about, heard about earlier, is a sense of community, helping families be their best and support their children no matter what they're struggling with.
Dr. Hutton?
Yeah, I think what we're hearing is that we need a health system that is really proactive rather than reactive, right? Rather than waiting until the problems start to appear, detecting them early on and addressing them. I was so pleased to hear Sophie really advocate in support of Medicaid funding, because Medicaid is a funding program that allows us to do this work, to screen to have clinicians reimburse for that screening, to intervene. I can tell you that in our clinic, we're actually implementing some of the things that Dr. Willing just mentioned, where we have a clinical social worker who meets with patients who are having difficulties in, related to anxiety, depression, or maybe they don't even have a diagnosis yet, but we sense there are ways in which we can proactively help them. And this social worker will sometimes provide direct therapy to the patient in a way that's really supportive and healing. In other cases, just help the patient sort of navigate the services that are available in their community so that they can get care. But again, this particular social work, we pay her out of grant funding and out of philanthropic dollars. There's not robust funding to support her work, and yet I know the work that she's doing is good, it's high quality, it has wonderful outcomes, and our patients love her. But we need the funding in order to be proactive, and we need the funding to be set up in a way that we're incentivized to be proactive rather than reactive.
And I think that's something lawmakers can actually address, because our systems do what they're designed to do, what we reimburse and allow. And another piece of that is really, we have the federal mental health block grant, and it is only supposed to be used for children who meet criteria for a serious emotional disturbance. If we really want to move upstream and help with prevention and early intervention, we should be allowing some of those funds to be used absent a diagnosis. We shouldn't have to wait until a child meets that criteria. And in fact, there is bipartisan legislation, the Early Minds Act, that could be passed, and it would allow for that to happen. So I think there's a lot of positive things that can be done to help craft the system that we really want to see.
And when we're talking about prevention and intervention with youth mental health, childhood mental health, behavioral issues, what does that look like in real terms? Because oftentimes I think they kind of maybe conflate it to something maybe sinister in their mind. That they think maybe these are, unknown clinicians kind of taking their child into a back room and like talking to them. But what does it really look like, in real terms, in practice?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think it's hard for people to imagine because there hasn't been much focus on prevention and early intervention, or enough, I'll say, enough focus on it. It's really important. Mental health applies to everyone, right? Every single human being on the planet needs to learn coping skills to help deal with stress. Every single person has stress. Every single person has anxiety. So we could think about this like anticipatory guidance. When you go to the pediatrician, right, they ask, okay, is your child wearing a bike helmet when they ride their bike? Is the car seat facing the right way, right? These are things they ask everybody, and it's not stigmatized. We could do the exact same thing with mental health, right? What coping skills does your child use? Which ones are effective, right? How is sleep going? All of these things and behaviors and skills and strategies influence how we are developing. And if we talk about it, that opens the door to identify when something isn't going quite right. And we can help funnel people towards early intervention. It could look even more than that, right? We could have behavioral health well visits, right? That would be a real radical change to the mental health system. But we have well child visits. They're pretty standard, right? They're very accepted. We could do the same thing for mental health.
And most general practitioners, they're not, particularly trained when it comes to identifying or addressing mental health issues. Would you say that that's accurate?
Pediatricians are very capable of.
I take that back.
Yeah, I would say pediatricians are very capable of this. But point taken that not every person needs to see a specialist right away, right? I think some people do. We definitely need psychiatrists. We need specialists. We need highly trained psychologists and the whole continuum of care and experts. But not everyone needs that or doesn't need that right away. And so we really need our primary care workforce to do this as well. And there are new efforts in medical residency training that pediatricians will all be trained in mental health care.
You had something to say?
Well, I'll just add that, I think a key piece here is normalizing treatment. And as others have said earlier, the head is attached to the body, and we need to treat mental health as just part of regular health care. And so when it's integrated, that makes it so much easier. Another piece, though, that I think we could consider doing in terms of policy is allowing providers to treat the whole family. Because when a child struggles with a mental health problem, it is often the whole family that is affected. I know my son's brother really needed help understanding how to deal with a sibling who had extreme behaviors and who was always getting kicked out of school, all those things. And frankly, I worked with a family where the child was in a treatment program. And the father turned to me and said, you know, I have an alcohol problem as well, and that may be contributing to all this. I should probably get treatment. That was this incredible window of opportunity. But the treatment program said they couldn't talk to the father, they couldn't refer him to treatment, so that window of opportunity was lost. And it was because the identified patient was the child. And we really need to break down those barriers. We need to treat the whole family because all of us have a responsibility to each other.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Dr. Willing. You're highlighting that pediatricians can and should do this work, that we often can treat mental health conditions, both upstream and when somebody needs treatment like medications or therapy. Unfortunately, the status quo is falling short, right? So what I observe is that many pediatricians are seeing, patients every 15 to 20 minutes. And the way that sort of mental health screening and identification happens is really an afterthought, right? Pediatricians are doing the vaccines, they're doing the blood tests, they're sort of, doing the anticipatory guidance. And then they're taking a look at that screening tool that maybe the family has filled out when a patient has come in. And that screening tool is screening for often depression, anxiety, symptoms of ADHD. And if the pediatrician identifies that, oh no, this patient is actually expressing on their screening tool that they're having thoughts of suicide, I know that many pediatricians are thinking to themselves, shucks, I'm going to be running behind now, right? And we want pediatricians to be saying, oh, wow, here's an opportunity for me to step in and help someone and take the time and space to have a good conversation, to build trust, and to make sure that this young person gets the attention that they really need right now. But unfortunately, everything is so set up to be reactive, to squeeze as many patients in as we can. So again, we need the time and space to build the trust and build these relationships so we can help people heal.
I think that's an interesting point because I think, as we've heard, and I think a common notion is that getting mental health care or the treatment you need, the onus is kind of on the person who's suffering in the moment, or it's on their family to get it. But as you pointed out, sometimes physicians recognize the need, but there's something within the system is disincentivizing them to kind of take that step to getting them the treatment or referring them to the right source. What are there other aspects like that in the system that kind of prevent a care provider from reaching a patient who might be in need?
Yes, there are. I'll start with one is access to care. And we can look at this in a couple of different ways. One way is workforce shortages, and there are a lot of different reasons that financial incentives are not set up to build a robust mental health workforce. I would encourage us to take a look at mental health parity and mental health parity enforcement. A big part of that is having an adequate network, right? A full continuum of care for every level of care, right? So that would be inpatient beds, residential treatment facilities, partial hospitalizations, IOPs, intensive outpatient programs, intensive therapy that's outpatient, as well as outpatient office visits, and crisis care, and emergency rooms. And so that same pediatrician might also be thinking, oh, shucks, where am I going to refer this patient to, right? I know the wait list is 6 months long. So this is such an opportunity, right? If we have an elevated screener, this is a chance to connect someone. This is a chance where they may be interested in receiving care. And so there needs to be an adequate workforce and an adequate network covered by insurance, right? That's available to step in and take care of that patient.
Absolutely. Additional?
Well, I'll just build on that because we talk about the workforce. Yes, anybody who's looked for care knows there aren't enough psychiatrists, enough therapists out there. It's so difficult. But there are a couple things that get in the way. First of all, Inseparable is working to make sure that insurance companies are actually providing the care that people pay them for. And too often, insurance companies are really shortchanging the people that they cover. They are implementing ways to deny care, to even claw back payments years after a provider has provided services that are medically necessary. So when we have an insurance system that does things like that, that drives actually therapists out of networks. In fact, some therapists even give up altogether. We did a recent focus group with a number of therapists who were at wit's end with the amount of time and energy they had to spend on the phone every single day battling to get badly needed care for children with really intense behavioral health care needs.
I will say I talk to physicians often for my work, and a common complaint I hear is they are so sick of paperwork. They hate, I don't know a group of people who hate paperwork more than doctors. You don't even have to ask them. They're like, oh, by the way, I hate paperwork. Did you know that? We have a few minutes left, and we heard Senator Tillis talk about he kind of looked into how to be a better caregiver for his grandmother. And we've also discussed the need to include family members and those who are close to the person or the youth, young person in need. How do we support caregivers themselves as they're, trying to be there meet their, family member where they are? Because, if a pediatrician isn't necessarily the most trained, then, your mom and dad, God bless them, they're probably not the most well-equipped either.
All right, I'll dive in. As a caregiver, I can say one of the things that was most important to me was really peer supports, meeting other families, and having the advantage of an education and support program with my peers that taught me to understand about different mental health conditions, about symptoms, about how to be the best support to somebody who might be struggling, and just to know that I wasn't alone and to have that help navigating a system. And yet these are things that are done by volunteers across the country, and they really ought to be part of our healthcare delivery system, just an integral part where you can get that kind of education, support, system navigation. Because the worst thing is feeling like you are all alone, that you're the only one who is struggling with something. We need community, and it's community that lifts us up.
Yeah, I completely agree and really want to build on that because I think that this exact type of service, whether it's parent groups or direct services individually to a parent to help support them in doing the work to support their child, actually really needs to be a part of our healthcare system and paid for as part of our healthcare system, exactly as you've said. From my lens, I am working with young people who might be struggling with addiction, who might be using substances. And I see them, maybe once every 2 weeks, maybe once every week for a patient who's really struggling. That's often for only 30 or 45 minutes per patient. Every other minute of the day, they're going to be in the care of other folks, whether it's the school or their parents when they're at home in the evenings or in the mornings. And so the work and the support of that child needs to continue long after they leave my office. And so I'm thinking that parents are really the ones that can drive the care plan forward for me when I'm not, with the patient directly there in my office. And so to the extent that we can support parents to do this work and give them the health and healing that they need to support the work, our kids are going to be better.
And there,
I'll just quickly add, this brings me back to a robust workforce, which in this case to support families includes family support therapists, family support specialists, family therapists, and care managers.
and there's definitely interest in I think it was last year there was growing interest in recognizing people. A lot of our family members become unofficial caregivers. They do it for free. They're sacrificing hours they could be spending at work earning money for for the sake of these family members because they can't afford care or there isn't that level of support. And I think there is some federal attention rising to recognize family caregivers who are they're not paying with they're not getting paid with money or then they're paying with their own time. Well, that is all the time we have today. I want to ask for a round of applause for our panelists today. And one more round of applause for all of the previous speakers today as well. All right. And I will hand it off to Michelle.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. This was so wonderful. That concludes our program for today. I appreciate you all being here in person, and for those tuning in online, thank you for tuning in. And we'll see you out back for some fruit and coffee and water and whatever else there is. Thank you.